Professor Grix here. All right, so obviously class is canceled today because of the impending hurricane. So first of all, I hope everyone is safe and sound and that your property and loved ones are also safe and sound. I can't give you guys a free day, and rather than have you guys do some reading in the textbook or do some random homework, I figured I'd just kind of talk to the camera and do the lecture like that. This is how I'm used to teaching, and I figured this is a pretty good way to do some makeup work. And it actually happened that I really landed on my feet here. I'm staying in Atlanta with some friends, and they actually have a YouTube channel called The Oddlings. They're a Let's Play kind of channel with puppets. And so I'm here actually in their studio. It's really awesome. They've got these really great lights and all these like advanced recording devices, which I'm not using. So I hope that you can hear me okay, because I'm just using the random stuff I have on my laptop. But as you can see, the setup is pretty sweet here. I got this awesome lighting. I got the soundproof foam behind me. Not a bad place to get stranded, I guess. All right, so let's go ahead and pick up where we left off with chapter 6. Let me tab over here. There. All right, so last time we were talking, we mentioned the reasons why people draw, whether it's as a sketch, as a finished work of art, as a prep work. Now we're getting into the materials and techniques themselves. I want you to know, as you can see here, the different types of media. I want you to be able to recognize them. I want you to know their basic technique and their basic pros and cons. Let me hide this. There. All right, so these are the different types of drawing materials. I'm going to address these kind of in turn. And as you can see, all of these media are drawing media, but they're very different tools. They require different techniques. And there's no one drawing tool that's better or worse than any others. It just depends on how you like to work and what kind of lines you like to make. So as you can see there on the top, the drawing pencil creates a very fine, thin stroke. The brush in the center creates a very variable, deep, dark stroke. It goes from wide to thin. So if you want a lot of variation in line weight, that's the one for you. If you want variation in the value, which is the grade from light to dark, you might want to choose perhaps a charcoal stick or the Conte Crayon up here. And as you can see, some of these ink media give you either a consistent line, a thick to thin line, or a very consistently thin line. Again, none are better or worse. It just depends on what you like to use. Now, one thing that most artists try to achieve is a sense of three-dimensionality in their art, and that gets into shading techniques. Now here, let me tab over to the camera again, because I want to show you basically how these shading techniques work. Luckily, I brought my sketchbook with me. There are three basic techniques that at least the book addresses. There's lots of different techniques, but I'm going to show you, can you see that? Hatching, cross hatching, and contour hatching. Oh, that's reversed. Oh, well. All right. So as you can see, hatching is just a series of parallel straight lines. So here, let's assume that the light source is coming from the corner up here. Hatching would just be a series of straight parallel lines designating that one part of the form is darker than the other. More lines on this side connotes that this area is in shadow. But with hatching, the lines have to be parallel and straight. Cross-hatching is whenever you create a multiple of lines, but they intersect one another. They cross, as you can see here. So as you can see, one area looks quite lighter and the other area looks quite a bit darker. It's not because my ink is a different color. It's obviously all the same color. It's just that I've placed more lines on that portion of the drawing. And again, the lines intersect. They cross over each other, whereas with hatching, the lines only go in one direction. And now, contour hatching. As the name suggests, this is whenever the shading follows the contours of the object. So I don't know if you can tell from my brilliant drawing, but I'm drawing some apples here. Contour hatching, that would be whenever the lines are curved. And they can cross over each other, or they can just go in one direction. But again, the lines are curved. That's what contour hatching looks like. There are actually a lot of other shading techniques that the book doesn't address, like stippling, which is just a series of tiny dots you might see in something like old comic book illustrations. And if you're working with a soft medium like charcoal, whoa. Another way of creating shading is by blending it down with your finger to create kind of a softer transition of tones. But again, that's just some of the basic methods of shading. And of course, shading is also something that you would use in one of your vocabulary terms that connotes light to dark areas, areas of bright highlight, and dark lowlights. Do you remember what it's called? Chiaroscuro. All right. So now let's take a look at the different media. We're going to start with dry media. Whoops, went too far back. All right, so there's dry media and there's liquid media, which means ink. We're going to take a look at the dry media first, which is charcoal, Conte, pencil, and pastel. I forgot to put that down, sorry. Dry media come in different grades, from soft to hard. And I put together this little flow chart to show you how the hardness or softness of the media affects the kind of lines that you use. If you use a soft media, like charcoal, they're good for creating dark lines, broad strokes. One of the advantages of very soft drawing media is that it's very easy to blend. But the hard part is that it creates less detail. It's just such a broad, soft material. It'd be hard to do fine lines like, say, eyelashes. But if you want to get that fine detail in there, you might want to choose a media like a pencil, which gives you very fine lines, greater detail. But the lines tend to be a lot lighter. They aren't quite as bold and dark. And since they don't blend well, they work well with hatching techniques like I've just shown you, cross hatching, contour hatching, and the like. All right, so let's look at our first dry media, and that would be pencil. So what you need to know is what the media is and how it's used. What pencil is? That substance in the middle, we often call it pencil lead, but as you may know, it's actually not lead. It's a material called graphite. Graphite is a mineral, and actually the name of the word graphite, the root word is graphein, Greek for writing. And so graphite is a mineral that's very well suited for drawing. Typically, pencils, of course, have a wooden casing around them. And if you ever purchase some drawing pencils, as you can see here, they come in different grades. It does say they're lead grade swatches. Again, it's not technically lead, it is graphite. So let me show you what that looks like. I've got a set of drawing pencils here, and as you can see, it's a long set in this metal case. If you take a look at the back, it shows you the different grades, and it creates different qualities of tone, value. But on the whole, drawing graphite is pretty hard. So I've pulled out here my 2H, which is a very hard pencil, and my 8B, which is quite a bit softer. So here is the hard pencil, and it creates that kind of typical fine line you might associate with pencil drawings. And that is the 8B. See how the stroke is a bit more broad, not quite as fine, and you can also see that it's darker. Again, soft media create darker lines. So this 6B here, this creates a much darker line. Now, personally, I don't do a whole lot of work in pencils, but I did want to show you one drawing from my book that I did at the National, what is it, the Natural History Museum, the Smithsonian. My favorite animal, the giant ground sloth. I used different pencils on this one, from hard to soft. And let me show you an example from the book. As you can see here, this work of art uses actually a combination of pen and ink and graphite pencil. So all of these fine lines around the edges, those were probably done with the harder pencils here. Now here's a question for you. What type of shading technique does this work of art employ? This is an example of cross-hatching. See how the lines are straight, but they're not all going in one direction. They overlap one another. They cross each other, hence cross-hatching. And it does create this wonderful sense of three-dimensionality. I really like this drawing. It really looks like he could almost talk to you. I can almost hear his deep, booming voice as he gives a sermon. But as you can see, there's not a lot of shading in this, at least not a lot of blending. As I said, with graphite pencil, the lines tend to be kind of clean and very sharp. So if that's the kind of line that you like, well, then maybe this is the medium for you. All right. Next is the dry media of charcoal. What is charcoal? It's wood. Wood that has been charred, which is to say burned, dehydrated, reverted to carbon in a fire. And just like with pencils, charcoal comes in different grades, from hard to soft. In this sample, this swatch that I chose, oh, and by the way, these swatches, I just found them on the internet. They're nothing in your book or anything. They're number one. That's a very soft charcoal. It's actually not even made of wood. It's made of vines. So if you can imagine dehydrating and burning a vine and crumbling it in your fingers, that's what vine charcoal is. It's very, very, very soft. But as you go over to the 7 and 8s, you can see how the lines are becoming a bit more fine. They're also a bit lighter in value. And that's because it's using a bit of a harder wood. The charcoal itself is not nearly as brittle or as crumbly. But on the whole, on the soft to hard ratio, charcoals occupy the softest and pencils are the hardest. This is a drawing done with charcoals. And one of the nice things about these chapters and teaching you about these media is that it really does help you appreciate the work of art. This is art appreciation, after all. And I don't like working with charcoal. Here, let me switch over to the camera again. These are some charcoals that I have, and they are very soft. They're super messy. They're already all over my fingers. I used them a second ago to show you a shading technique, but yeah, I can't stand it. But it is very soft. So here, let me show you. That's the softest pencil. And that's the charcoal line. See how much darker it is? And see how it's not as fine? See how it's a bit more variable? That's because this is so much softer. It just deposits more material down and therefore tends to just be a bit more messy. And again, you can blend this pretty easily. And this is good if you like sort of soft areas. They even have blending tools. I'm using my fingers, but yeah, see how it's kind of getting a bit softer? Like I said, I hate working with charcoals. I just think they're really messy. My hands are all dirty, and that's driving me crazy. And so whenever I look at this drawing, I'm really impressed by it because look at those fine lines of the web. That's not white charcoal. That's the paper showing through. That means that she actually had to shade all the negative space inside those lines and not make a huge mess. I think that is really, really impressive because charcoal is so soft and so smudgy, it just goes everywhere. Again, that's why I don't like it. I mean, look at this. In my sketchbook, imagine I drew a beautiful drawing and then I put this in my backpack and take it home and half of my drawing ends up on the opposite page. Actually, yeah, can you see that? Made a mark on the opposite page, and it kind of muddied up the lines that I made. Yeah, look at that. Look at that huge mess there. I hate it. It goes all over the place. Why would I spend all this time making a beautiful drawing just to have it smear all over? Well, luckily, the great people at art supply stores have found a solution, and anybody who's ever worked with charcoal or wants to work with charcoal is also going to purchase one of the greatest inventions in the art world, Fixative. What is Fixative? It's a varnish. Varnish is it's something that you place over a work of art when it's done. It helps protect the work of art from the elements. Painters have used varnish for centuries, and this is to keep the paint protected, to keep it from getting dirty. And girls, if you've ever done some designs on your nails, you'll probably finish it off with a coat of clear nail polish. That is kind of like what varnish is. But Fixative is a specialized type of varnish for drawing, and it's available in an aerosol format, and it makes a huge amount of difference. So I did bring with me this sample I made. Here, check this out. So this is a simple, just charcoal illustration with Fixative and without. So with Fixative, it goes all over the place, but without, it's a lot cleaner. It's still a little bit dirty, but as you can see on the smears on the paper, the Fixative makes a big difference. I just ran my fingers over it, and you see how the Fixative has sealed the particles of charcoal onto the paper, and it's transparent. You don't see like a yellow film over it. So hooray for Fixative. And that's something you'd want to bring with you. Like if I wanted to do some drawings, I'd also want to bring a can of Fixative with me to seal this drawing and keep it from smearing all over the place and keep it from getting all over my fingers. Yuck. Like I said, hate it. Oops. All right. Dry drawing media number 3, Conte Crayon. To be honest, this isn't a very common media anymore. Conte is something that you'd see a lot in older works of art. What it is, it's graphite, the same sort of graphite that you'd find in those drawing pencils, but it's been ground up and mixed with clays. And then that mixture is pressed into sticks, and that's what you draw with. So one of the things about Conte Crayon is that it gives you tone. It gives you some color. But think about it. It's clay. So it's earthen material. So the only colors you're going to get out of Conte are going to be the kind of colors that you'd find in the soil. Reds, browns, blacks, and maybe even whites. All right. So this drawing here, I think, really does effectively show Conte. You can see that area of tone there. And I also like it because it shows another element of Conte Crayon. Depending on the ratio of graphite, which is hard, and clays, which are soft, the grade of Conte Crayon varies from hard to soft. So which areas of this drawing here do you think use the softest Conte? That would be like down here, the dark shadows, these blurry parts. Whereas the harder bits of Conte would be like down here. See those sharp, fine lines? And everywhere else kind of a middle ground. Like I said, I don't even have any Conte Crayon. I couldn't find any at the store. I did want to show you really quick. So that's my pencil drawing. This is a set of charcoals that I used. Like I said, I don't use charcoals a lot. I find them too messy, and I really only draw whenever I go to museums. This is my museum sketchbook, but these are some charcoal sketches that I made, and you can see that they're a bit darker, a bit softer, because that's just what I felt like drawing that day. But it was a pretty hard charcoal pencil. As for an example of Conte given by the textbook, I like this drawing better, but the wise publishers have chosen this one. If you looked at this and thought it was charcoal, that would be an understandable mistake. But actually, as you can see, it's done with Conte Crayon. Looking at this one, I'd say it's probably a soft charcoal or a soft Conte Crayon because the lines are very blended and very soft. But this drawing shows something else that's very important. Whenever you draw, what do you draw on? Well, paper, of course. But if you've ever spent any time in an art supply store, you know that there's paper and then there's paper. There are so many different varieties of paper. And what do you notice about this paper? Again, see how textured it is? See how it almost has this texture like canvas or something. Different types of paper are very smooth. Some of them are very rough and coarse and have a texture to them. That texture is called tooth. So that's one of your vocabulary terms. Tooth. How rough the drawn surface is. The paper that I am using here in my sketchbook, here, let me tab over again. This is a pretty smooth paper. There's not a lot of grain to it. There's not a lot of tooth. And honestly, that's one of the reasons why my charcoal is smudging so badly, because this paper is just too smooth. If I were to do like soft charcoal on, say, a piece of typing paper, which is very smooth, the charcoal would barely even stick. It would just all fall off the edge of the page. But if I do a charcoal on a paper that has tooth, it's going to stay in place more because those little particles of carbon, they actually sink into the grain of the paper and it's more in place. That's another reason why that drawing I just showed you was so smudgy. The paper was very smooth. It had almost no texture to it. So this drawing, since it is done on such a textured paper, a paper with tooth, it's going to stay in place a bit better. If you were to run your fingers on this, it probably wouldn't smear as badly. All right, so those are the monochromatic drawing media. Let's take a look at some drawing media that have color. And in drawing, that's pastels. Now, just like any other drawing media, pastels come in different grades, but they're all the same thing. A pastel is a stick of pigment with a little bit of binding agent. Now, pigment and binder are two elements that are going to come up a lot in the painting chapter, but it all amounts to the same thing. Some sort of ground up color. It's just like a soft ground up color, like a powder. You mix it with some sort of binding agent and then it's pressed into sticks. What you see here on the screen are two different types of pastel. Both of these are made by Sennelier, which is a really, really good example of pastels. They're kind of like the gold standard of pastels. But I can show you, I actually have a set of both types of pastels here. So these are my set of chalk pastels. These are done by Rembrandt, which is also a very good brand. And the pastels of Rembrandt, they're pretty, and that's the brand, not the artist. They're very soft. This is comparable almost to like a stick of chalk, like sidewalk chalk. But I also have a set of oil pastels here. And this is a bit more comparable to a crayon, a wax crayon from Crayola. Or even it can be as soft as, say, like a lipstick. So here is red, the same basic color, the same basic pigment. That's the chalk pastel. Here's the oil pastel. Virtually the same, but they've handled differently. I wish I could pass these around for you to use so that you can kind of see the difference in how they pull. But again, it's like the difference between a nice soft sidewalk chalk versus drawing with lipstick or crayons. That is chalk pastels and oil pastels. Chalk pastels, soft, a soft grade, so they fall under the same criteria as like drawing pencils. Oil pastels tend to be a bit harder. Let's take a look at an example. Oops, wrong way. All right, so this work of art here is done with pastels. If you were to say, wow, I really like this painting by Rosalba Carriera, I would take some points off because this is not a painting, this is a drawing. This is done in pastels, and it's actually really, really good. Pastels can blend just the way that charcoals can. But in this case, this one doesn't have a whole lot of blending. The lines are a bit too sharp. I would take a guess, and this is just an educated guess, that this artist probably used oil pastels. And just judging on the time period, I think oil pastels would have been used at this time here in 1735 or 1725. I was close. But again, that's just an educated guess. Also an educated guess, you see that question mark? We've got a bit of a running debate in class. Is that a boy or a girl? The book says portrait of a girl, but I also found another resource that said that this was a boy, that this is the portrait of the son of so-and-so and so-and-so. I was like, well, geez, now I'm all confused. I don't know, I just thought it was kind of interesting that I was a little perplexed by this. Is that boy or girl? I did also have to look up, it says girl with a boussola. A boussola is what she's holding here. It's like a cookie, only instead of being flat, it's in a ring or in a shape like a pretzel. So that's like a dry cookie that she's holding. Looks pretty good. All right, so this is a pretty fine pastels. The pastels were done actually by layering them. This one, the pastels are a bit softer. I actually saw this piece in person, and you see how broad the strokes are? See how they're not really blended, they're just kind of layered on top of each other. This is just an example of, again, the different types of pastels. I'm pretty sure, whenever I looked at this, that this was chalk pastels. But again, that's just an educated guess. And by the way, for the purposes of this test, and just the class in general, if you're getting confused, just knowing what pastels are, that's good enough for me. The book doesn't make a distinction between chalk and oil pastels. This is just me being a picky pants. All right, so that's all of our drawing media. Again, the dry media, that would be pencil, charcoal, Conte, and pastel. Now we switch gears and we talk about liquid drawing media. And that means one thing. It means ink. Drawing with ink. So the difference between the tools and techniques, it's not the color of the ink, it's what you use to draw with the ink. So try and think of some examples of media that you would use, tools you would use to get that ink down on a piece of paper. So usually in class we brainstorm a bit, and some examples that people often think of are dip pens, like quills. By the way, in movies, whenever you see people use quills with a big feather on it, that's actually not historically accurate. Quills usually would take off most, if not all, of the fletching here. But I guess it just looks cooler to have the actual feather on the end. Another type of tool you would use, as you can see here, are some calligraphy pens. These are also dip pens. You can also have cartridge pens. Brushes. This is a media used by a lot of Asian cultures. China, Japan, for example, most of their drawing is done with brushes rather with pens. That gives you a lot of variation from broad to thin, dark to light. Felt tip markers are another example of a ink drawing tool. And then lastly, ballpoint pens, where there is ink inside of a cartridge, but rather than flow out of a channel like it does with a calligraphy pen, with ballpoint pens, it's actually pretty cool. There's a reservoir of ink and it flows onto a ball, and whenever you draw, it rotates the ball, picks up the ink behind it, and deposits it on the paper. All right, so here's the thing about ink. And here, let me tab over again. I just bought this new, oops, hang on. There it is. All right, I just bought this pen. I'm really excited to use it. I like working with markers. I don't like drawing with pencils and charcoals nearly as much as I do like working with markers. I have a set of sepia-toned markers. That's what these are. And I also work a lot with just broad black markers. I like markers that give me a lot of variation from dark to light, from fine to thick. And if you can't tell, my whenever I take a sketchbook to a museum, it's mostly just as a way for me to jot down my ideas and observations. I don't intend any of this to like end up in a museum or anything. I actually really like markers that have a brush tip. What I've got here is an example of a cartridge pen with a calligraphy nib. I really like working with this. It's a lot of fun. All right, let's take a look at the textbook. Enough of my yakking. Get out of here, that. All right, can you guess what culture produced this drawing? This is Japan. This is by the artist Hokusai. And in Japan, this is done with a brush. So can you see the different variations from thick to thin? That's not a variation in the ink. The ink is all the same color. The variation is how thick the brush strokes are. And with brush drawing, whenever you push down, it creates a broad stroke like you see here. And whenever you pull the brush up, vertically up off the paper, it tapers down to a point. I don't know if you've ever tried doing a brush drawing, like to do, say, Chinese calligraphy characters, but it's a lot of fun and it's a unique challenge. So one way of creating areas of tone with ink is to use those hatching techniques, because you don't really blend the colors together. Again, ink doesn't come in different grades. It just comes in one tone, black. But there is a way of sort of creating areas of middle value, and that's by diluting the ink with water. That is a technique called using a wash. So a thin, transparent layer of paint, or in this case, ink, that's called a wash. So take a look at this drawing by Rembrandt, and I can see areas where he used hatching, like here. But I can also see areas where he used a wash, like down here. So we've got that middle tone. Look at her face. To create that middle tone, that middle shade, he didn't hatch and he didn't blend. He diluted the ink down, and he created that thin layer of color here. And yeah, so those are, again, the different techniques, the different media, for the purposes of testing, recognizing the difference. What is pencil? What are charcoals? What are the advantages of working with charcoals? What are some of the disadvantages? Like I said, it's really messy, really blendy. What's the difference between pencils and Conte crayons? Knowing what they are and being able to recognize them whenever you see it on a test. The examples I'll give on the test will be the examples that you see in the book. I'm not going to bring in random examples like my sketchbook. So I hope this presentation was helpful and not too boring. Thanks for sticking with me all this time. I do appreciate it, and I hope that you all have a wonderful, safe weekend. I'll see you whenever classes are back in session.